All right, so today we're going to learn our Okay. So today we're going to learn our last method for solving quadratic equations. This method, I think, looks a little intimidating. We are going to spend 3 days on it like we did completing the square. I think completing the square is harder than doing the quadratic formula. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. And like I said, I think it probably just looks a little more intimidating than it actually is. So I want to kind of, before we start the quadratic formula, I want to kind of recap what we've talked about so far. And I know since you guys are always thinking about math and wondering, how can I use this in real life? What's the point of this? You may be wondering, why do we keep needing new methods? We mastered how to solve by the square root method, and then we learned how to solve by factoring. And then I threw another method at you, which was completing the square, and now I'm throwing another one at you. Why do we need all of these methods? Well, it turns out that typically there's not one method that works for every type of equation. So for example, the very first way to solve quadratic equations that we learned was the square root method, where if I had x squared equals 9, I could square root both sides. We'd get x equals plus or minus 3. Those were so easy, and it would have been awesome if that's the only method we ever needed. But then I showed you guys that, okay, if we had something like x squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0, I can't do the square root method here. Because if I made this say x squared equals, on the right-hand side I have equals 2x plus 3, and I can't take the square root of that to solve for x. So then we learn how to solve by factoring. Okay? And we do x and x, we go minus 3 and plus 1, set each factor equal to 0, and solve. And that really wasn't too bad either, but the problem with that is if I have something like this. If I have, let's do x squared minus 6x minus 2 equals 0. And if I was trying to solve this, what I would need to do is I need to look for factors of negative 2 that add to a negative 6, right? Because you want to solve by factoring. I can't solve by the square root method because it has that x term. So if I try to solve it by factoring, there's nothing that multiplies to negative 2 that adds to give me 6. It doesn't work. So I can't solve this by factoring. I would have to solve this by completing the square. So I'd have to move the 2 over, find your magic number, factor it, square root it, and on from there. Now, what's going to happen next is, what if I had a problem like this? What if I had a problem that said x squared minus 9x minus 3 equals 0? I can't do the square root method because I have that x term. So the square root method is where you would get this into x squared equals a number. But I wouldn't have a number on the other side. I'd also have that minus 9x, which isn't going to work. If I wanted to solve by factoring, I'd be looking for factors of negative 3 that add to negative 9, which there aren't any. So if I wanted to solve by completing the square, you technically can solve this one by completing the square. You have to move the minus 3 over. But then watch what happens when you were to find your magic number. To find your magic number, you would take 9, divide by 2, squared. And what happens when you take 9 divided by 2? It gives you 4.5, a decimal. Or if you want to leave it as a fraction. And if you think about what we have to do with that numbers, I have to add it to both sides of the equation, which, okay, whatever, that's not too bad. But then you have to factor a decimal or a fraction. We've never done that. It is possible. You can do that, but we don't want to do that. So there's going to be some problems that you can't solve by the square root method. You cannot factor them, and you just simply don't want to solve them by completing the square because it's going to give you a fraction or a decimal. That middle term there, it's odd. You don't want to do completing the square. So we have what's called the quadratic formula, which is this beautiful thing here. Now, where the quadratic formula comes from, every quadratic function, every quadratic equation can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. We've talked about this a lot, where a is the number in front of your squared term, b is the number in front of your x term, and then you have your c. Okay? If you were to take that equation and solve for x, which is super duper fun because you don't even have numbers, you have just x's. It involves completing the square, some factoring, and all sorts of other fun stuff. This is what you get, okay? And here's how you say the quadratic formula. To find out what x equals, it looks like negative b, but we're going to call it the opposite of b, kind of like when we were finding the vertex. Whenever we're graphing a quadratic function and we do x equals the opposite of b over 2a, kind of the same thing, because if b is already negative, it might be kind of confusing if we're talking about this as a negative. Okay, so the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, I mentioned at the very beginning, I think this formula looks very intimidating. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to, but the thing is, it's a formula, okay? And what we do with a formula, if you think about science class, you use formulas all the time in science class. Like maybe you have a temperature in Fahrenheit and you want to turn it to degrees. You have a formula for that, right? It's the 9 over 5 and then C plus 32 or something like that. And you just plug the number in and you simplify and it gives you your answer. That's how a formula works, right? That's all this is. If you want to know what x equals, you plug in all these numbers and it basically gives you your answer. Now, we have to do a little bit of work, but instead of having to factor, instead of having to do completing the square, this formula, once you get good at it and once you get used to using it, you plug the numbers in, you simplify, and it gives you your answer. So let's practice using this. We're going to keep it really simple today. We're going to do these two examples and then just two examples on the right-hand side, and then I'm just going to let you practice a few, okay? So to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula, the first thing that's very, very important is the equation has to be set equal to 0. Because what we're going to do next is we're going to figure out what A, B, and C are. A is the number in front of your x squared, b is the number in front of your x term, and c is that constant. But this is only a, b, and c if it's equal to 0. So the first thing we want to do is set it equal to 0. Then we're going to identify a, b, and c, paying close attention to the signs, whether they're positive or negative. And we're going to plug in the values and then simplify very carefully, and then we're going to take it really slow. Okay? So let's try this first one here. So I have this equation that says 3x squared minus 4x minus 4 equals 0. So I don't think you can probably see them super well on your printouts, but this kind of little blank template for you can kind of help you figure out what numbers to plug in and where to plug them in. The quadratic formula, and we're going to say this over and over and over again the next few days, is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay? So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out what a, b, and c are. And we are going to get those from our equation. A is the number in front of your x squared. So if you look at your equation, my x squared is right there, which means my a is 3. B is the number in front of your x term. So in this case, paying close attention to the signs, my b is negative 4. And c is going to be that constant. It's going to be the number that's not attached to a variable. Once again, paying close attention to the signs, my c is negative 4. Okay, now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these three numbers. Anywhere in this formula that you see an A, you're going to plug in 3. So we're not typically going to do it this way, but just to kind of keep it carefully since I have this format here. Anywhere you see an A, like right here, like I said, I know you guys can't really see it probably too well on your printout, but right here, it's 4A. So wherever we see an A, we're going to plug in a 3. There's also another A down here in the denominator. So those are the two places we're going to plug in a 3. Just plugging them into the formula. Okay? Now for the B, anywhere you see B, you're going to plug in negative 4. So right here, that's a B. Right here, that's a B. This right here is your C. My C, once again, pay close attention to the signs, is -4. Just plugging numbers into the formula. Yes? We will here in just a second, okay? Now, plugging the numbers in, you have to be very careful, very, very, very careful doing that, okay? If you can't plug the numbers in correctly, there's no way you can do the rest of it correctly. Once you get used to plugging the numbers in correctly, the first step of simplifying is the toughest. The very first step, this step right here. So this is the one you want to take very, very slow. Now, like what Kenna was saying, as I go through and I start simplifying things, the first thing that we were supposed to do is my formula tells me to take the opposite of B. And you can kind of see here that my formula has a -4, those two negatives together. Or another way to think about this would be the opposite of -4. What is the opposite of -4? A +4. So that's the first step in simplifying. Now the next step in simplifying, we're just going to copy down the plus or minus. We're going to copy down that big square root sign. And then we're going to look underneath the radical sign. Now what's underneath the radical sign, guys, I'm telling you this first step is so important that you do it correctly. The first thing, this right here says b squared. Now kind of like when we were doing completing the square, remember how we did to find the magic number, b divided by 2 squared? And I said you don't really have to worry about the sign because we're going to square it anyway. And anytime you square something, it's going to be positive. That's the same thing here. What we really, really want to get in the habit of doing is using parentheses when we plug in our numbers. And I know since we had the boxes, we didn't really do that, but we want to use parentheses when we plug in our numbers. Because this is different than this. This is only squaring the 4. This would be -16. This would be -4 times -4, which is a +16. That's one of the biggest places mistakes are made. Okay? The next thing that you do is probably like the second or third, maybe the first most important thing you do. Okay? You are going to take b squared minus 4ac. So you have b squared, and then we are going to multiply 4 times a times c, but I'm going to have these two terms. I know it says b squared minus 4ac, but that sign is sometimes going to be a minus and sometimes going to be a plus. Here's how you're going to decide which it is. You are multiplying 3 things together right here. -4 times a times c. You guys see that? -4 or a -4 times a times c. You're multiplying 3 things together. You want to look at the signs of these 3 numbers. The 4 is negative. The 3 is positive. The 4 is negative. So I have a negative, a positive, and a negative. When I multiply a negative, positive, and another negative, what kind of sign is that going to be? A positive, right? Those two positives are going to come together and give me a positive answer. That's so important that we can figure out that sign correctly. And then go ahead and multiply the numbers. Once you figure out the sign, 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 4 is 48. And then we're going to draw a big fraction bar. And the denominator says 2 times a. So 2 times 3 is 6. If you can get past that first step, the rest of it, once you get the hang of this, is really, really easy. Okay? So we are going to do 4 plus or minus. That part stays the same. Now, underneath the radical, 16 plus 48 would give me 64 all over 6. And when you're trying to figure out what the next step is, kind of look at what you have. I have 4 plus or minus the square root of 64. Well, I could take the square root of 64, so let's go ahead and do that. The square root of 64 is 8, so it's going to be 4 plus or minus 8 over 6. And now this is going to be kind of like what we did with completing the square. My 2 answers are going to be either 4 plus 8 divided by 6, just like we did with completing the square, and 4 minus 8 divided by 6. Now, big thing here, if I gave you this and had you guys do this, you probably wouldn't have any problem doing that, but the problem is I think we rely a little too heavily on our calculators. And if in your calculators you do 4 plus 8 divided by 6, it's going to give you the wrong answer. Why will this give you the wrong answer? Your calculator is going to divide that first because it doesn't know that it's in a fraction. When you guys know, I need to add those right before I divide. If you're going to plug this in your calculator, that's fine, but you have to put parentheses on it. Or you could do 4 plus 8, enter, divide by 6, enter, and you get 2. Same thing. 4 minus 8 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 6, that's not going to come out evenly, so let's just go ahead and reduce, and we would get negative 2/3. So your two answers are 2 and negative 2/3. The quadratic formula, once you get the hang of it, I promise is not too bad, but it does take some getting used to. Okay, this next one, you are not going to have any like this today. We'll go back over these tomorrow, but I'll go ahead and introduce you to these ones. Okay? So, first thing, that very first step, if you look back up there at the steps where it says to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula, step 1 says set the equation equal to 0. When you set something equal to 0, it just means everything is on the same side, which it's not. I have that 1 on the right-hand side. So the first thing we're going to do is subtract 1 from both sides. So we would have 5x squared minus 2x minus 1 equals 0. Okay, the next step that we want to do is we want to go ahead and identify a, b, and c. Remember, it's a x squared plus b, including the sign, which is going to be a negative 2. And then my c, since I moved that negative 1 over, or since I moved the 1 over, it's now a negative 1. Pay close attention to the signs. Now, I know in the last one we just kind of went through and filled out the a's, and then filled out the b's, and filled out the c's, but that's all we're going to do in our homework. So let's go ahead and fill them in as we kind of read the formula. So my formula says x equals, first thing, and let's get in the habit of doing this, I need the opposite of b. The opposite of b. So if b is negative 2, what's the opposite of negative 2? A positive 2. So I'm just going to kind of write over that negative so we don't think we haven't already done that. The next thing, plus or minus the square root underneath the radical. Huge here, guys. Underneath the radical especially. Use parentheses when you're plugging in your numbers. We are going to take b squared, so negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a, using parentheses, times c, once again using parentheses, all over 2 times a, which is 5, using parentheses every step of the way. Okay, first of all, do you guys have questions on how to plug the numbers into the formula? Okay. This is the most important step. This is the step. If you can get by this one, usually we're in the clear, okay? So we're just going to read the formula, and we're going to kind of simplify what we can. So we're going to start with, we already took the opposite of b, so we're going to leave that as 2 plus or minus the square root. Now, underneath the radical, the first thing we want to do is we want to take b squared. Now remember, it really doesn't matter if b is positive or negative. You're going to square it anyway. But since we put parentheses around it, it's just kind of an extra reminder that negative 2 squared, negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. Okay, this is so important, guys. The sign that comes after b squared. So important because it's a minus 4 times a times c. There's 3 numbers there. A negative 4, a positive 5, and a negative 1. Okay, the 5 is positive. I'm not going to worry about the positive. But see how I have these 2 negatives here? What's going to happen to those 2 negatives? They're going to cancel out and make a positive. So it's going to be a plus. And then we're going to go ahead and take 4 times 5 times 1. 4 times 5 is 20. 20 times 1 is 20. All over. Big fraction bar underneath all of that. And then in your denominator, 2 times 5 is 10. If you can get by that step, usually we can get to the answer. Okay, so when you're looking at your problem and deciding what to do next, I can't really do anything with the 2 plus or minus, but under the radical sign, I can take 4 plus 20, that gives me 24, all over 10. Now the next step, this is what's not going to happen today, because if you notice the next thing, the only thing I could do here is take the square root of 24. If it was the square root of 25, that would be awesome because it would be 5. But the square root of 24, that's not a perfect square. It's going to give me a decimal. So you're not going to have to worry about this today. Tomorrow we will, but I wanted to go ahead and throw this example at you anyway. Just like we're going to be completing the square, we're going to round. We're going to write it as a decimal. So the square root of 24 gives you about 4.9 all over 10. Once you get to this step, now you're ready to break it apart into your 2 answers. Your 2 answers are going to be 2 plus 4.9 over 10 and 2 minus 4.9 over 10. Remember, if you're going to use your calculator, that's fine, but you have to either do 2 plus 4.9, enter, divide by 10, enter, or in your calculator you need to put parentheses to tell your calculator you need to add first. 2 plus 4.9 is 6.9. When you divide that by 10, you get 0.69. Same thing here. 2 minus 4.9 is negative 2.9. Divide by 10, you get negative 0.29. Okay, so once again, your problems today, we won't end up with any non-perfect squares. We'll throw those in again tomorrow. Okay? So let's get this glued into your notebook. This is page 45, 9.6, the quadratic formula.
Down to the office right away, and we'll have you sign out and go with your cars. Thank you.
Okay, first one, let's do x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Okay, so one thing that we want to do today is for every single homework problem, I would like you to copy down the quadratic formula. So, the quadratic formula, this is going to be like your best friend this week. Here's what the quadratic formula is. X equals, to solve for x for any problem, you're going to take the opposite of b plus or minus the square root, draw a big old radical sign. Underneath the radical, it's going to be b squared minus 4ac. Now, this is one of the other big mistakes that I see. That fraction bar needs to go underneath everything. It's all over 2a. So the next thing that I'd like you guys to do is just off to the side, let's identify a, b, and c. Now, you can only identify a, b, and c if it's equal to 0, which this one is. So to start with a, it's a x squared. Well, there's not a number there, so what's my a? 1. And then it's bx. What's my b? Negative 2. And then my c? Negative 8. Okay, now, the same thing we did on our left-hand side, except it's already written out for you. We're going to take these numbers, we're going to plug them in. So x equals, first thing my formula tells me to do is take the opposite of b. What's the opposite of negative 2? Positive 2. Plus or minus the square root. Okay, guys, this is so important. Please, 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 I am begging you, use parentheses when plugging your numbers in. Because I'm supposed to take b squared. So negative 2 squared. We already know it's going to be positive, but just kind of an extra reminder that we put it in parentheses. Minus 4a, which is 1, times c, which we said was negative 8, all over 2 times a, which we said was 1. So the first hurdle to get over is plugging the numbers in the correct spot. The next hurdle, and this is the biggest one, is getting past this first step. Okay? So we are going to leave it x equals, I can't do anything with the 2 plus or minus, but then we're going to do the square root. Now, underneath the radical, first thing, when we take b squared, remember it doesn't matter if b is negative or positive because you're going to square it anyway, but as an extra reminder, negative 2 squared, negative 2 times negative 2 gives me a positive 4. The sign that comes next is so important. I'm multiplying negative 4 times 1 times negative 8. Those three numbers. Negative 4, 1, and negative 8. What kind of sign is going to come next? A plus. The negative and the negative turns make positive. That's not always going to happen. It just kind of has for these problems. Okay, but this one is going to be a positive. And then we'll take 4 times 1, which is 4, times 8 is 32, all over 2 times 1 is 2. I promise you, if you can get past that step, you can kind of like start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay? Next thing, I can't do anything with the 2 plus or minus. Underneath the radical, I can take 4 plus 32. We get 36. Still all over 2. Remember, everything, that fraction row goes underneath everything. Okay, kind of looking here, I can take the square root of 36, right? So it would be 2 plus or minus square root of 36 is 6 over 2. Now you can break it apart into the two answers. So we are going to take 2 plus 6 divided by 2 and 2 minus 6 divided by 2. 2 plus 6 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 2 minus 6 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. It's kind of a lot. I know there's a lot of steps, but once you get the hang of it, every single problem, it's kind of like completing the square. You're going to do the same steps for all of the problems, okay? Let's go through the second one here, and then you'll have a few minutes to work on your homework. Okay, let's do negative 3x squared minus 11x plus 4 equals 0. First thing, I would like you guys to get really comfortable what the quadratic formula is. Like I said, it's going to be your best friend this week. So let's copy down that quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then we want to take a second to identify that A, B, and C. You can only do this if it's set equal to 0. Once again, this one is set equal to 0 for me. So my A is the number in front of your x squared. So we have A is negative 3. B is negative 11. C is 4. Okay, and then we can plug our numbers into our formula. So we're going to do x equals, first thing, I need the opposite of b. What's the opposite of b? Positive 11 plus or minus. We are going to be excellent students and write all of our substitutions in parentheses. So we're going to do in parentheses negative 11 squared, b squared, minus 4ac. So A is negative 3, C is 4, all over 2 times A, which is negative 3. Okay, this next step is the big one. So we're going to do equals 11, that stays the same, plus or minus the square root, all of that stays the same. When I take negative 11 squared, we get a positive 121. That first number is always going to be positive. And then the sign that comes next, we have negative 4 times a negative 3 times a positive 4. What kind of sign is going to follow the 121? a plus. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and multiply. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 4 is 48. All over 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. That's the big step right there. Now let's add 121 and 48. So we're going to do 11 plus or minus 121 plus 48 gives me 169 over negative 6. And then we can take the square root of 169, which is 13. So it's going to be 11 plus or minus 13 over negative 6. And then we can break it apart into our two answers. 11 plus 13 over negative 6. 11 minus 13 over negative 6. 11 plus 13 is 24. Divide that by negative 6, you get negative 4. 11 minus 13 is negative 2. And then when you get negative 2 over a negative 6, it'd be a positive. And if you reduce, you would get 1/3.